Okay, diolch yn fawr, bore da. Just said that there's an incoming call from reception. Not now, please. Okay, so good morning, and I'm here today to talk to you about my son's story. So this is about his experience during the height of the pandemic, and I've called it Locked Away in Lockdown. So my son is called Jack, and he has a learning disability, autism, epilepsy and ADHD, and I felt that this would be a good place to start. So this picture was taken on Jack's 16th birthday back in February 2019, and we treated Jack to a zoo experience, and he loved it. He got to feed the animals and stroke the animals and brush them, and we had a really good day. And sometime between the spring and the summer of that year, things went really wrong for Jack, and we don't know why. His behaviour started to deteriorate. He absconded from school. He was very unhappy. His epilepsy worsened, and his special school could no longer meet his needs, and no local alternative provision could be found. So Jack was at home with us 24/7, and we weren't given any psychological support. In fact, we still haven't really been given any psychological support. And we were told that there was a choice between Jack being sent to a secure residential place in Southampton or being sent to somewhere else in Wales, but that would be 105 miles away. And we went for that place in Wales because that was the closest to us, and it was devastating for our family, and we're still feeling that today. So here we are in March 2020, and Jack had just turned 17, and he'd been at the residential for around 3 months at this point. And then this happened. Jack fell really poorly, and it took 3 weeks to diagnose what was wrong, and I believe that was due to failings in the healthcare system. And by the time he got blue lighted to hospital, his appendix was badly perforated, he had a twisted bowel, he had a blockage in the bowel, and he developed peritonitis. As you can see in this picture, Jack's weight plummeted. He went down to 7 stone 1 pound, and COVID had reached the hospital by this point, and we were really frightened, if he caught COVID, what could happen. So Jack was discharged from hospital. He was still very poorly. He went back to the residential, and 3 days after being discharged, on Friday the 13th of March 2020, we were told, we're going into lockdown. You've got just over an hour, and you've got to say goodbye and go. We were so shocked, and me and my husband Michael, we could barely hold it together, but we thought we're just going to have to try not to show Jack. We did our best, but I think he could sense it, and he did have a big meltdown that day. And he was recovering from surgery and recovering from 2 stomach drains. And and my last memory of Jack was him standing in the corridor with his face just ashen and his eyes just wide with terror. So Wales went into lockdown on March the 23rd, 2020, and I had to look back through my diaries, which was really hard to do actually, but I had to look back through them. And it was really interesting because I hadn't recorded it at all, and I think that's because for us, lockdown had already started back on Friday the 13th. So Jack was given information trying to help him to understand what was happening. I don't think he really understood any of that information, but this is an example of some of that information. And the 22nd of March was Mother's Day, and my first Mother's Day without Jack. And this was the card that I received in the post. And Jack spoke to us on Skype for the first time. He was really confused. He was tapping the screen, asking how we'd got in there. And the first few weeks were really hard, and my diary entry for March the 26th just simply said, missing Jack dreadfully. We sent Jack cards and we sent him small gifts and my jumpers so that he could smell me. I sent photographs to create a photo wall for him. And I remember at the time I just kept his bedroom door shut. I could not bear to go in there. Jack started to settle, but he still missed us. One of the best things we did was we bought Jack a go-kart and we had it sent up to the residential and he loved it and they did film Jack on it. We also had our first Easter without Jack. That was very hard. Jack believed in the Easter bunny still, he still does. And Easter was a time for family. And I remember putting lots of Easter eggs in a box in the family and sending them up, emailing and speaking to staff, make sure he has his Easter eggs. And I managed to get through to Jack quite late on Easter Sunday. And I spoke to Jack and said, "Oh, have you had your Easter eggs?" And Jack said, "Yes." And Jack tends to give a stock yes, sometimes when he means no, sometimes he'll say yes, even when he hasn't understood the question. And I had this sinking feeling, I'm not sure here. And I rang again on the Easter Monday and the staff member didn't know what I was talking about. And it took several days to work this out, and the Easter eggs were then found and opened in a box in the office. And I cried for days about that. Okay, so I work in the field, and at the same time as worrying and missing Jack, me and my colleagues were getting increasingly concerned about what was happening to people with learning disabilities in general. One of the things we were hearing about was do not resuscitate orders being placed on people with learning disabilities. And I was so concerned that I rang up my local Jack's GP surgery, and I thought they'd just say, "Oh, Mrs. Cavanagh, you're being a bit silly." But they didn't. They took it seriously, which says all we need to know, really. And they actually checked, and they came back to me, and they said, no, you don't need to worry, but we have noted down your concerns. And I did write this piece for Learning Disability Today, which came out at that time, which talked about the DNRs, and it also talked about the Coronavirus Act, a piece of legislation that applied to the UK local authorities and gave them emergency powers to tackle the pandemic. And one of those powers or measures was easements or flexibilities as they came to be known. And they did lead to the relaxation of some of the key provisions in the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. And I did write about that in this piece. So back to Jack, we were keeping in touch via Skype. As you can see, he didn't quite always understand Skype, and sometimes we saw half the face. And these are screenshots taken at that actual time. One thing that I couldn't understand was that Jack was still legally a child. He was under the age of 18. And if you look at the European Convention on Human Rights, it protects the right of the child to have contact with their family. We were protected to have custody and contact with our child, but we couldn't get an answer on that. And in Wales at the time, if your parents had split up and they lived apart, you could move between the houses. But we couldn't see Jack, even though he was still legally a child. And to be fair to the manager, he was trying to find out about this because Jack was the only child in the home at the time. I wrote to the Children's Commissioner and they didn't know. And we never actually did get an answer on that. Sometime into lockdown, Jack was starting to struggle with Skype. I got quite angry as well because I was being told, look, he's having parental contact. He's having Skype. And I was like, that's not parental contact. That's not the same as being physically present with your family. And the novelty of Skype was wearing off. There were times when Jack would accidentally turn it off and get very frustrated, or the technology wouldn't work. And Jack was missing our physical presence. And in the end, he wouldn't actually talk to us on Skype. He would just type. And we'd get things like this. Can I come home now? unhappy, and scared. And then in the end, Jack just gave up and didn't come on at all, as you can see. So we just couldn't talk to Jack on Skype. Jack's anxiety got really high. It just was going up and up and up. He's always had repetitive speech, but nothing like this. And when we went on the phone to Jack, he would often say, "Is it scary times? Is it scary times? Is it scary times?" And we couldn't get anything other than this. The other one was, "What's around the corner?" So you just get this on a loop. Is it scary times? What's around the corner? What's around the corner? And this is all we would get. He was terrified of the coronavirus. He was terrified of PPE, and particularly masks, and staff would often say that he would try and pull masks from people's faces. Oh, good, it is working. Alice is moving. Jack's always loved Disney films, and around this time he became really fixated on Alice in Wonderland, the old 1950s version. I have a theory as to why. If you think about Alice in Wonderland, everything's very upside down, isn't it? Everything's confusing. And Alice herself says at one point, "Oh dear, everything is so confusing." And I do think it was Jack's way of trying to understand what was going on around him. And perhaps it was also a way of expressing how he felt at that time. So this was a very dark time for Jack. He began to self-harm. He became selectively mute, so he went through hours where he would not speak. He would ask staff if they would be his mummy and his daddy because he didn't know where we'd gone. And he would strip off in protest, and he would even smear excrement on his own body, something we'd never seen before. So that's just how bad it was for Jack. And his behaviour deteriorated. And then we had this, supine restraint, and quite a lot of it. So supine restraint is when you're lying on the floor and the back of your head is against the floor here, so you're looking upwards. It's not the T-supine restraint where the arms are held out. That was actually banned under the serious case review for Winterbourne. So this is the type of restraint where the arms are held down by your side. That's still going on across Wales. Lots of it. But if you look at the Welsh Reducing Restrictive Practices Framework and you type in the word supine, you won't find it there. And we have no national data on its use. So this was happening to Jack, and Jack drew this picture of himself being restrained when he came home for a visit when the restrictions were starting to lift. And he just drew it one day. And I said to him, "What's this, Jack?" And he said, "This is me on the floor, in a floor hold mummy." Just like that. But when Jack was usually restrained, it usually involved 7 people holding him down. And I think the reason why we've got the 2 here is probably because he couldn't fit them all on, but also because they were more likely to be the 2 that got to Jack first and would have been working with him at the time and would have been in his eye line. So Jack's in the middle. It looks like they're holding axes, the 2 people holding Jack. They're not axes, they're alarms, and they've been drawn in an exaggerated way by Jack. And I think that's quite interesting because he became very frightened of alarms, because whenever he saw an alarm, it was oh my gosh, am I going to be put into restraint? After being restrained, Jack would be sometimes too distressed to talk to us. On the occasions when he would, he was obviously crying, shouting, and I managed to record in my diary the things that he was saying. So I would get things like, "I've reached my limit," "I hate them, make them stop," "They hurt my fingers," I would get, "They hurt my toes," "They'd hurt my back." I didn't know they could happen at night, because up to one point they were just happening in the daytime. And then when they happened at night, he was then afraid of the night. "I'm a failure" was a common one, that feeling of shame and self-blame. And "report them, mummy. Report them, mummy." I have seen Jack be put into restraint on many occasions, And it's an awful experience because he's calling out to you to make it stop, but you can't do anything about it. It's had an irreparable effect on my relationship with Jack. Because I'm his mother, and a mother is supposed to be able to protect their child. So it does have an extremely damaging effect on the parent-child relationship. I want to state that I know, from having spoken to staff in the months after this, that they were feeling very worn down and disempowered at the time. That's not to excuse what happened, but it's trying to understand what happened. I know that many were absent, many were off shielding. Some had tested positive, or they'd come into contact with people who had tested positive. I know that residential was down to a third of its staff at one point. And I know there was a lot of confusion over the Welsh guidance, because the manager said to me many times, I don't know, we're waiting for the guidance to come in, or I'm not sure what this means. And there was often an increased use of agency staff. And I think Patterson says it best, that when services and practitioners are under stress, the default culture can become restrictive. And it certainly did in this case. Even as the restrictions were lifted, people like Jack were still locked down. And yet few people, if any, queried the legal basis for it. Jack's key worker took this picture of Jack at a time when restrictions was being lifted, but he was still locked down. And I think it just shows how Jack was feeling at that time against a very sterile, institutionalised environment. I do feel that infection control came at the cost of human rights, but I also feel that in institutions, it's very hard for human rights to kind of be met anyway. It's very hard for them to penetrate there. It's even hard for the law to kind of fully penetrate there too. Then I want to talk about this, the care home guidance, because did I have some problems with that? I had some problems with it because it was blanket. The guidance was the same for everybody, regardless of whether you're an elderly person in a care home or someone like Jack, who was usually quite fit and young and healthy. In terms of the visiting guidance, I was really pleased that I was able to challenge that, and I did influence the Albert Heaney guidance, and that led to starting to have those outdoor visits. But even for Jack's residential, they decided to go their own way and do something a bit different to begin with. And we got this letter come through from communications and marketing that said, yeah, you can see your child, but only if you take them out for the day. And we were like, well, we can't do that because Jack needs support. And they said, yeah, but we can't provide you with that support because we're short-staffed. And we said, well, that means we can't see Jack then. And they were like, no. And we were like, that's not good. So we wrote to Ed Morgan, the Health and Social Services Minister, and she agreed with us, and she got in touch with the residential, and after she got in touch, suddenly we could see Jack outdoors. And it was around this time as well that Jack's story just started to appear. It appeared in All People's First Life in Lockdown Diary series, and I wrote a piece for Peter and Friends Talk About COVID, which was a Steve Hardy and Co project. So Jack's story was starting to get out there, but only within sort of the learning disabilities circles. So now we move on to June 2020, and we get to see Jack. After 15 weeks and 1 day. And I have had people say to me, you don't need to add in that 1 day. And I'm like, yes, I do. Because every single day mattered. Every minute mattered that we were away from Jack. So we saw Jack on Saturday the 20th of June. We saw him for 1 hour. The Welsh guidance at the time was for half an hour, and the residential recognised that wouldn't be enough for people like Jack. It could take about half an hour for him to settle in. And also they recognised that we were travelling 105 miles to come and see him for half an hour. So again, that was that lack of flexibility of recognising that people may need reasonable adjustments in the guidance. We had to see him in PPE. And I do remember that when we arrived, a female member of staff who I didn't know at the time met us and said, I'm very, very worried because Jack is insisting that when he sees you, he's going to hug you. And we've told him he's not allowed to hug you. So when he sees you and he comes to hug you, don't hug him. And I said to him, I'm not doing that. I said, I'm hugging him. And she said, well, if you do that, I'll have to report you to the manager. And I just said, well, you'll have to report me to the manager. And of course, when Jack came out, what do you think he did? What do you think he did? Hugged me, yeah. And I hugged him back. And this lady dropped off to go and report me to the manager. And the manager was actually quite a decent chap. And he came out. And I remember standing there with my arms like this, going, come on then. And I said to him, I've hugged Jack. And he went, I know, it's fine. And off he went, and that was the end of that. So, August 2020, and Jack comes home for his first visit, and I love this picture because look how happy we both are. And Jack's residential started to take a different approach, a more individualised, personalised approach. It started to take into account the effect of no visits on Jack's mental health and well-being. And it wasn't long after that that Jack was coming home every month. We were going up every fortnight. But that wasn't happening for everybody else. There was an issue with the guidance in that it was quite open to interpretation, and different providers were interpreting the guidance differently. I mean, I knew a family at this time who had a daughter in a residential. Their village was next to the village where the residential was. And their daughter wasn't coming home, and when they went to see her, she was seeing her behind perspex glass, and her daughter was deaf. And she was sitting there in full PPE, and yet my son was coming home. And it was a crazy situation. That should never have been allowed. Okay, so this is the Guardian piece, movie story in the press. And I want to tell you how this came into being. I was sitting at home, watching TV, seeing all the stories about social care and thinking, okay, all I see is elderly people in homes. I'm not seeing people like my son. What's happening to all the people in assessment and treatment units? What's happening to all people with learning disabilities in psychiatric intensive care units right now? And it really concerned me because we knew that some of them were dying. And I got in touch with a few journalists, and it was Saba Salman from The Guardian who got back in touch with me. And Saba said, yeah, let's do it. And I said to Saba, I know 2 families. She said she knew another family. And we put together this story. I can't tell you how many times this story went through the lawyers. It went through back and forth, back and forth. And the reason for that is because Saba was trying to protect us, because she said, when you speak truth to power, there can be consequences. And when that story came out, I had people who called me, who said, well done, Dawn, and everything. But I also had people who shouted at me down the phone. And I had people who followed my Twitter account. And I had some unpleasant messages too. So it did cost us as a family to come out and say what was happening. Learning Disability Wales raised this issue at the Learning Disability Ministerial Advisory Group. I met with Julie Morgan, and I was given a lot of sympathy, but sympathy doesn't do it. It doesn't solve the problem. And I'm going to be quite frank in saying Jack's situation's only got worse. And I can't see how things are really changing or changing for the better. I joined the fight to help get people prioritise the vaccination. I know Men Cap Cymru were very much involved in that. But I think now what I thought then, why are we doing this? Why do we need to do this? It should be obvious. Over the months and into 2021, there were many ups and downs of the lockdowns. You can probably remember them. There was the one of autumn, the one of winter, 2020. Jack's home shut down many times. The residential was quite fortunate in a way because it was split into many different homes, and they were able to keep people and staff separate from one another. But the Welsh guidance at the time was that if just one person got COVID in the residential, then the whole place would shut down. So that meant that Jack was often shut down. And of course there was Omicron when that first came in at the end of 2021 into 2022. That actually led to a lot of core staff leaving and some good staff leaving. and agency staff coming in. So they're, it's been tough. Okay, this one. I thought long and hard about whether to put this picture in, but decided that I would because it's integral to Jack's story. But I've changed it to a pencil image to kind of protect us as a family, but I hope it still does have some emotional impact. Jack's nana, my mum, died during COVID. Jack was very, very close to his nana, and he didn't get to see much of her during the pandemic. So he had to say goodbye to her via a Skype call with his support staff member. And this picture was taken around 1 week before my mum died. And we forget that amongst the COVID bereaved are many people with a learning disability, and that this is how many of them had to say goodbye. And many of them haven't had bereavement support, my son included. I was also asked to comment on the locked out report by Debbie Foster, which looked at what happened to the lives and rights of people with learning disabilities during the pandemic. I actually did my interview in the garden just before my mum's funeral, and I almost didn't do it because it literally was just before my mum's funeral. But I felt it was really important, and I went ahead. It got a lot of media attention, but very little reaction to it. And I remember feeling very disappointed. And I actually almost took it a bit personally. It felt like nobody cared. So that was that. And so here's Jack. This is actually Jack thinking about his nana, actually. I'd like to say this is where Jack's COVID story ends, but it doesn't end there. The impact is still very much felt today, and I think it will be felt for many, many years to come. So I'd like to just finish on what we can learn from Jack's story, so please bear with me. And I'm just going to quickly highlight that sometimes autistic people and people with a learning disability are sent to live in special hospitals, and they often have to stay in these hospitals for a long time because there is no good support for them in the community. So this is what I feel we should learn. People living in care homes or hospitals did not always have their human rights respected. And we need to find out what happened to people living in care homes or hospitals during the pandemic in Wales. And this information could help stop the same thing happening again. Welsh Government advice was the same for everyone living in care homes. This meant that the advice did not always meet the needs of people with learning disabilities. This was because of a lack of reasonable adjustments and because decisions about risk were not made for each person or home. The Welsh Government also gave care homes more power to make their own rules, and this led to homes having different rules, and some homes were more strict than others. In the future, people with learning disabilities should have a say in how any advice affects their lives, and Welsh Government should make sure that any advice meets the needs of people with learning disabilities. Children with learning disabilities should have the same visiting rights as children without learning disabilities. People who had someone they cared about that died need support, and people who had a very upsetting time need support. You know, I'm an interviewer on the coronavirus and people with learning disabilities study, and I'm also someone who's involved in the Our Stories part, so I get to hear all the very detailed stories. Many, many people had horrific times during the pandemic, and many people lost loved ones. But what I hear again and again is the lack of psychological support and the lack of bereavement support, and that's not good enough. The coronavirus pandemic just made life more difficult for people living in hospitals and residentials. People should not be living in hospitals or residentials, care homes. People with a learning disability should have their own home. What the pandemic has done is made it more likely that people with learning disabilities will end up being stripped of their human rights. It's made it more likely that they'll be locked away. It's made it more likely that they will experience physical, mechanical, and chemical restraint. The support that people with learning disabilities need to live in their own homes, in their own communities, has been stripped and stripped away for years and years and years now. It is so easy to get sectioned when you have a learning disability. It's so easy. Because the Mental Health Act is so flawed and archaic, and it's almost set up to so easily be able to do that when you have a learning disability. And there are people in Wales who aren't following the right processes either, but so difficult to get discharged. This is a failing of the system. It's a human rights scandal. It's down to a lack of will and a lack of action, and we could change it today if we wanted to. And I'm going to leave you with this thought, that as I speak right now, to you right now, my son, at this point in time, could be on the floor being restrained. He could be being taken and put into the seclusion cell and forcibly injected. That could be happening right now. Or if it's not happening to my son, then it's happening to somebody else's child in Wales. And I don't think that's good enough. I think Wales is much, much better than that. So I will leave things there and the opera.